Well, welcome to another week's of devotions. We're going to continue to meditate on the cross during this week. For lots of people, of course, the cross remains a mystery. For some, it just seems to make no sense whatsoever. And for others, maybe they just see it in terms of some kind of lucky charm. What it is, though, is that the cross is hard to avoid. It's featured in all kinds of places and in all sorts of different ways in our society today. We see it in art, we see it being drawn, we see it being painted, we see it being engraved, and so on. It can feature in terms of the shape of traditional Anglican churches. So much of what defines our nation in terms of its history is centered around the cross and the story, the Christian story that emerges from it. Even football players today cross themselves often before running onto the ground. And of course, that's a way of hoping that their actions are going to be made sacred in some particular way. The cross can be very powerful, but of course then it can be sanitized, so it loses its power. When you think of the cross, it is simply a place of execution. And it would be very odd to see people wandering around wearing maybe a gallows or a chopping block, or whatever, an electric chair, some place of execution. And yet the cross seems to hold a place, even in contemporary thinking within our society. We're going to think about the cross today in relation to slavery. We often think of slavery as something that was abolished, that is part of our past. But of course, the truth is that slavery remains a live issue in our country. Only this week, the athlete Mo Farah opened up about his own experiences of what it was to be trafficked and how he was brought into the country and had to work as a domestic servant. Sadly, slavery remains part of our contemporary world, particularly in the United Kingdom. Slavery in the world in which the New Testament was written, of course, was commonplace. There were all kinds of different levels of slavery. Some slaves were well respected and carried a certain amount of authority within a household. Other slaves were dispensable. They could be got rid of, sadly, even sometimes killed. Among the worst treated of all slaves were some of those that had to wait daily in the marketplace. They would wait for someone to come along to purchase them, to take them as slaves, sometimes not just individuals, but sometimes family groups. When we talk about the cross as a place of redemption, this is very much the context in which the writers view the cross. They see it as a work of redemption, set within a world of slavery. Let me read this morning two passages that help us to understand that. The first one is from 1 Peter 1 and verses 17 to 21. Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, so that your faith and hope are in God. And then again, Romans chapter 6 and verses 15 to 18. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God, that though you used to be slaves to sin, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. The picture then is of a slave market. People desperately waiting for someone to come and redeem them from this terrible situation. They're without hope, and of course they're despairing of life. And against all the odds, someone comes and pays the price for their freedom, redemption. Not to keep them as slaves, but to set them free. And Peter, in the passage that we just read together, focuses in on the price that is paid. Peter says it's not silver or gold, it's nothing material or anything obtainable. The price paid to set the slave free is the precious blood of Christ, Jesus, the sinless one, the only perfect sacrifice. He pays in his cross and his death the ransom price for the redemption from slavery, and brings us into freedom, which we can enjoy in and through Jesus. And that this was God's plan, and this was always God's intention. Paul comes from it, in the passage that we read from Romans, from a slightly different angle. He views us as slaves to sin. And of course, that has the most terrible consequences. But as we respond to the cross and all that Jesus has done for us, then we are set free. Set free for what? Well, set free to choose to live the righteous life that God, through the Spirit, can enable us to do. To literally, Paul says, become slaves to righteousness. And so we move from being slaves to sin to becoming slaves to righteousness. And that's something that we choose. We choose to bring ourselves under the ownership of Christ, the lordship of Christ. We have been redeemed. And so this morning, let's pour out a song of redemption. We have been set free to live as God always intended us to, through Jesus, the one who has released us from slavery to sin and brought us into his precious kingdom.